I want to tell you about this book, Human Expansive Edition. It's called the Expansive Edition because it actually is a reflection of my first book. And so my first book I wrote about 5 years ago, and it was very much, it was what I say is my journey of being human to myself, each other, and the world. But when 5 years passed and I kind of realized, oh, actually, there's a lot of things that I believed in at that time 5 years ago that I really have evolved or that have changed. There was a person, this part of me who I was 5 years ago and who this person is today has evolved, has changed. And so that's really what this journey is. Lucky for you, you do not have to buy the first book because it's in here, so you're welcome. You get 2 books in one, essentially, but the first book is in here, so you'll read the first book, and then after that, we get into the reflections of that book. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about some themes here. Before we even get into that, I do also want to thank those who read advanced copies. Hero de Michelis. Hero is someone who I actually did my mindfulness training with. Hero's done a lot of really amazing work. She's on the United Nations Peace for Purpose project. And so she does really, really amazing work, and I'm really grateful that Hero took the time to read this book. I also want to say thank you to Aya. Aya is actually a Berlin-based singer. I actually had the chance to interview Aya on my podcast, and she has a really incredible story about being in the Israeli army and then having to flee that afterwards. And this whole journey of learning that she is like her roots as a Moroccan Yemeni artist. So it's been a really, really interesting journey. You can check that out if that's of interest to you. But I'm really grateful for all these different voices. We did have some local voices as well. If you know Abigail Fogg, who used to be an NCAA player, Abby also read the book. I interviewed her as well. That episode's actually going to be airing on Shaw as of October 1st, so you can check that out. And I also did have, I don't know if you know Adrian Velaka. Adrian couldn't make it tonight, but he is the producer and host of Borderline Radio, and you can actually catch his show on NPR. And he also read the book as well, and so I'm really grateful that he took that chance. And again, just really highlighting local voices, everyone local who does really amazing work and really amazing things. So back to human, because I'm really good at talking and bragging about everybody else, but when I gotta talk about me, that's when I'm like, I don't know what to actually say. But again, so I wrote this 5 years after my first book, and I remember when I sat down to write it the first time, I was like, well, I'm gonna start off by reading my first book, and so I did that, and I hated it. I read the first book, and I was like, what the heck is this? Like, how did I even how was this on Times Square? Like, this is awful. And of course, obviously, it had nothing to do with the book. It was just kind of, I think, rereading a piece of work 5 years later and seeing these parts of you that you didn't see before. You didn't realize that was there, and then you see it again, and you're like, oh my God, like, who was this? And so I don't think I had an identity crisis, but I definitely did hate the book. And I did not touch it for another 6 months. I was like, I'm not even writing another book. I can't believe it. Like, there's no way. So 6 months passed, didn't even touch the stupid book. And then one day I was like, okay, you know what? Let's try this again. Let me be a little bit more graceful here. So I went back to my first book, read it, and I was like, okay, better, a little better than the first time. But I basically did that cycle for a solid 2 years until I finally ended up with what we have here. That includes actually deleting the manuscript off my hard drive at one point. That was awful. And so having to start again. And that was not salvageable, unfortunately. But yeah, so it's been a journey. It's been a journey writing this book. But when I look back, I realize every draft, every deleted manuscript, every draft was really just this version or this part of me I was continuing to shed, continuing to evolve. And I think that's been the interesting part of writing this book, is that journey. And I think it's interesting because when we think of artists, right, like, yeah, our work is what we share and it's going to resonate with you in the way that it resonates. But like for us, it's the process, right? Like there's so much that comes just from the actual art and the craft itself that we learn. And I'm sure DJ Seith can probably relate to that on some level. So that is how this book came to be. it was hell, in short, is what I'm trying to tell you. But it's all right because it's all about that inner work. Something that's important to me, but more important, is around how our inner work really reflects our outer work, or how our inner world reflects the outer world, and how we can contribute to change. So that's something that you'll see here in the book that I talk about, was how when I first wrote Human, I think I had that intention set. But by the time when I reread it, I realized the intention was set, but I still had some inner work I had to do. Now I can actually better embody that belief and understanding how those two worlds can come together, how I can bring my inner world and outer world together in a way that's a bit more authentic. And again, just in a way that's a bit more embodied based off of my journey and my healing. Another thing I would say that has evolved for me too is what I think healing is, and I talk a little bit about this in the book, that at that point, when I first wrote Human, healing was some destination or something I had to be, but I think now it's actually about liberation, and I think liberating ourselves from not just, hurt and pain and trauma. We all have our own lived experiences, but I think the stories that our trauma, hurt, and pain tell us about who we are, about what we're worth, about how we define ourselves, essentially how we see ourselves. And so I think that is something that has also really changed about me, and I think that, and about my definition of healing. I think liberation is something that we can all share, and that we can all have, and that we all really are, I think. And so you'll see that reflection in the book as well. I also actually did want to highlight one more thing. I did want to highlight another voice who actually read this book, and it's actually Chip Skowron, who used to be the CEO of Prison Entrepreneurship Program. And I am actually a sponsor of the Prison Entrepreneurship Program, part of my outer work that I do. And I meet every Tuesday with returning citizens that are leaving prison, and they're re-entering society, and they're trying to figure out the world. And I worked with some people that have spent maybe, have been out of prison for a week, versus some that have been out of prison for a day, some that have been out of prison for a year. And so my role is to just help them and support them in whatever way makes sense. And I've had to help them navigate the workforce. How do they get jobs? When you go to prison, if you have debt, that still racks up, right? So how are we navigating all these financial setbacks as well? But I'm really grateful that Chip took an opportunity to read this. Chip actually himself went to prison as well for insider trading. But what really was powerful to me, some words that he wrote, which are on the back, this book is not a self-improvement project, but a reorientation of your being. And I thought it was really, really beautiful, because when you read the foreword, you'll see his journey of how he did that, how he found community, and how that was something that was really important to him in his journey, and now he saw that reflected back in the book. And so I love that so much, because it just tells me that this book can work for everybody and anybody, wherever you are on your journey. There is something here for you, and so I'm really grateful that Chip did take a read through and offered really, really beautiful words. There are some specific things, themes that I did want to maybe just share today. One thing I think that was probably one of the more challenging things for me to write. I did talk a little bit about some of the sexual trauma that I experienced, and it was interesting because and I'll talk about it in the book, how in Human you kind of saw, in the first book you saw sort of glimpses of it. But that was because I didn't quite understand the experience myself. And so I was trying to kind of when I write about it in Human, and if you read it, you'll see it's kind of told in flashbacks. But I didn't quite know what it all was until 2 years after I finished writing Human. And so then I had all these realizations, and you start realizing what that experience actually was. And then you kind of have to backtrack, right? So now you have to start almost re-healing what you healed, because what you healed was what needed to be healed, but you still have, now you have to reorient it again. And so you'll see that journey and this realization in this book of how, that is why it was very vague. I would read reviews or comments that it was very vague. And it was vague. It was vague for a reason. One, the book is not my life story, right? It's meant to invite us to bring our inner and outer worlds together. But also, I didn't quite understand the extent of that experience at the time that I wrote Human. And so you'll see that reflection as well. You'll see that understanding of, yeah, it was way after the time that I wrote the book that I understood this was actually something that I had experienced. And so you'll see that play out. And I think that might make sense why the work of Nakehndan is something that resonated with me and why I understand the work that they do and why it's important. So that's one thread I did want to touch on today. I would also highlight too, around that time was when my father passed away, and so all of that was kind of happening at the same time that I didn't quite understand that experience. And so I'll talk a little bit about how that all that kind of muddled together was why it took me, I was like delayed in understanding what my experience was. And so you'll see that also echoed in the book as well. One thing that you will see that is present in the expansive edition versus what was present in Human is this, I think, this focus or this emphasis on learning to love ourselves, right? And I think not just the bubble baths and the candles and all that, but the real learning to honor every part of our journey, learning to understand every part of our journey, learning to understand ourselves and to realize, these things happened because, they happened. And when I look back, for example, when I look at my sexual trauma experience, you'll see in the book that I'm like, oh, I understand why I missed that. I understand why I missed a lot of the red flags in that scenario because of how it was attached to these others' ideas of what I thought I was worth. And so that reflection is also present. I'm just trying to think what more I want to say on self-love. I think it relates as well to the liberation point that I was making earlier. What it really means to actually love ourselves, right? Honoring every piece and every part of the journey, whether we liked it or not, right? Not really being angry at every part of the journey. It's just understanding like things are the way that they are. This happened the way that it's happened, and how can I love myself through these things? And so that's a very big learning that I hope to share with everybody today. I'm going to also read an excerpt here, if that's all right. And I'm going to read it from, obviously, the actual reflections, not the first book, because I hate that book, remember? So I'm going to actually start with the opening. You can join me if you'd like on page 83. When I first started promoting Human and people asked me what it was about, I often said human ignorance. And I felt this way at the time because of my own lived experiences, what I was healing, and where I was in my journey. The opening poem in Human invites us to acknowledge our ignorance, but the invitation is dark and lonely. This was because of how I experienced the world, often feeling the burden of society on behalf of humanity. More importantly, much of this was also the dialogue of the abandoned self, whom I've had to learn how to love since the time of writing Human. Thus, the aloneness woven through this invitation was a direct reflection of my inner world. And so the poem that I'm kind of referring to are these opening words. Maybe I will offer that here today as well, if I can find that. But again, I think it's really highlighting what I was saying, right? The self-love and learning to love the abandoned self, learning to understand her, learning to hear her, and I think learning to hear her in a very deep way. It's one thing to just like hear. When you're listening to someone just be angry, they're angry, but I think to hear underneath just the anger and to really, what we say in mindfulness and Buddhism is nurturing these seeds. How do we nurture the seeds of suffering? And I think that was a very transformative thing for me, which took years. It wasn't something I did overnight. It was 2 books in like 7 years, right? But it's a process. It's not the end point. It's something that we're just kind of always doing, always practicing self-awareness and always learning and practicing how to love ourselves. On that same page, I was going to move into the second paragraph because I actually really like this paragraph. It says, however, Human really portrays what it looks like when we turn our back to suffering, our own suffering and the suffering of others. Turning our back to suffering is not the truth of human nature. Thus, the expansive invitation embedded within these opening words is that our inner world creates our outer world, and the journey in Human reminds us that we can transform both. And I really like that paragraph. It is the opening of the reflections, but I think it really highlights kind of the mission, the intention, and the work, the inner work and the outer work part. I also think it's a very important reminder, given all the global suffering that we're really exposed to right now, and it's very heightened, I think, and it seems to be everywhere. I just feel like there's not a lot of peace anywhere is kind of how I feel when I watch the news, when I watch social media, and I think it's very hard to wrap your head around, especially because I think, violence is not our human nature, right? I don't think that that's really who we are, but I think if we're imposing violence or acting violent, there's obviously some things that are misaligned, but and we're suffering, right? If you're suffering, you're going to create suffering for more people, unfortunately. And so I think that the only way to really impart violence onto people is to be filled with hatred, right? Like it's so against our nature that the only way that we can actually justify being violent is being told stories of hate and discrimination and being instilled with fear. And so this paragraph to me just reminds me that there's more to us as human beings, that we are people who all really want the same things, that we are humans who are really built to help transform suffering of ourselves, but also others. And it's not our nature to turn our backs to suffering. And so that's what I also hope this book inspires people, is that we shouldn't be turning our back to the suffering of others. We shouldn't get lost in rhetoric. There's always a truth behind sometimes the things that we're told, especially in the media. And so I hope there's an invitation there to just dig a little bit deeper. And when we can see the suffering of others, when we see the suffering of ourselves, we'll see the suffering of others, and then we have an opportunity to create change. And so I hope that invitation is there here in this book for you. The other thing that was very prominent in Human in the first book was this sort of theme of darkness to light. And, again, I think it really sort of reflects this idea that I held at the time of healing being a destination where you go from darkness to light and yay, But I think in the expansive edition, we'll see how even that also evolves, that I'm not sure it's necessarily about going from darkness to light. I think it's about finding darkness within the light. And just like there's light within darkness, right? So it's finding light within the darkness, but also understanding that there's also darkness in the light. And which sounds kind of weird, but in Buddhism, that's actually the principle of like non-self and non-duality, where it's this idea that we understand that there's no left without right, there's no up without down, that all these things go together. And so when there's suffering, there is also non-suffering present, but we have to dig deep to find it. When there is not suffering, there can still be an inkling of that suffering somewhere. And we just have to know that they're always there. And when we can accept that, we actually find liberation in that, because we are now not living with some expectation that, well, I'm living in lightness now and it's always going to be this way. Or I'm always, in suffering, or I'm always in darkness and it's always going to be this way, right? We find that balance and we find that place that we can live from this sense of peace, and that's how we find liberation. So I would like to share the closing, actually, of the reflections, because I think it highlights that really quite nicely. And it actually does touch on, when you read the book and you read the end of Human, you'll actually see the specifics, what's highlighted, but it's the closing paragraph on page 113. From running in darkness to running in light, from running away to running toward, from racing the sunrise to embracing its rays, from hiding in solitude to being open to life. Human is more than a journey of darkness to light. In this expansive edition, it's a journey of darkness within the light. And there's a few, love is the lightness deep within the darkness. Love itself is expansion. When we see that darkness and light coexist together, we see the comfort in both the light and the dark. They are one, as we all are. And I think that is really the premise of this book, is again that transformation, the transformation of the suffering within us and around us, but this idea that, again, how do we liberate ourselves, right? How do we liberate ourselves? How do we become our expansive selves? And in a way that is storytelling. I don't believe in, prescribing things to people, even like as a self-help author. I don't believe in that because I think we're all on our own journeys. We all have our own lived experiences. And that doesn't mean therapy is not helpful. Definitely know what I'm trying to say. I'm just saying that, as an author, I believe in doing that through storytelling. What I try to do in all my book is I'm showing this was like my pathway to healing. It didn't make sense and it wasn't laid out for me. It was me just trying to trust the journey and trust the path and understand that these things were happening. And if I can't understand why, it's going to show up later. As I continue to navigate life, I will have that understanding later in life. And so that's something that I believe in about quote unquote self-help. I don't see this as just a self-help book. It's not just about our inner worlds. It's about our outer worlds as well and how that comes together, which is very, very important because most self-help only keeps us thinking about ourselves. And it's fine, but we do need to consider that our lives don't happen in a silo, right? I'm connected to people all the time. I share experience, share lives with our lives touch. We're in this room today, and we're all here together, so we are automatically part of each other's lives, just being in community here together. And so I think it's very important that we understand how our lives also intersect. And that's also when I wrote Human, and I talked about how human ignorance, that to me was human ignorance, was this idea that we're always passing people, but are we actually present? Are we aware of the fact that we're passing people? Or am I trapped up here in my head where I'm just thinking about where I gotta go, what I gotta do, what am I missing out on? And that to me was what human ignorance was at the time. That's evolved. I do think it's great that we do acknowledge though that we are connected to people and how we can be present with that and how we can use that to transform ourselves and everyone else and to be present with people. I do want to close before I turn this over to our wonderful friends over at Nakehndan. I did want to close with a really pretty quote. I did weave in, as you can tell, I've been practicing engaged Buddhism for about 7 years, and so it's kind of woven into just very subtly, just into the book. You'll see some subtle nudges, and I tend to, it's just something that really speaks to me very deeply. And so there was a quote here by someone who has influenced me a lot in a lot of my work. I just gotta find it. But this individual, his name is actually Nakehndan, and he is a Buddhist monk, and he trained, very traditionally, very young in Buddhism. So he was, with the the words escape, the monasteries, right? So he trained very traditionally. But he was also a peace activist, and he was most active during the Vietnam War. And he was actually, during the Vietnam War, there was the North and South governments that were fighting, and him and his community said, we're not picking sides. We're here to serve community. We're going to stay here. We're not picking any side. But because of that, no government trusted him. And so he was actually exiled from Vietnam. He had come to the U.S. to do a peace talk, and then when he tried to get back, they wouldn't let him back in the country, so he had to move to France, and he set up his own plum village there. But his work, his story is very inspiring to me, and for me as someone who, again, believes in this inner-outer world, the fact that he used this really beautiful practice that he shared with the West, but he really did a lot of peace work, and he was so truthful in it that he even accepted being exiled from his own lands and went to another country to continue to spread his work. But there's a quote that he shares in one of his books, and I actually share it here because I think it's really, really powerful, and again, especially given the climate that we're witnessing here, not the climate, but just the geopolitical tensions, the global suffering. And so, I'm not going to read the context in which it came from this book, but I want to share the quote because I think it's really, really beautiful. And it's something that it's something that sits with me all the time when I need to remember that we're all human beings. And when I see things that I don't like on the news, how do I see the humanness in people that are spewing hate, right? I think that sometimes that can be really hard. So on page 103, there's a quote here right towards the end of the page. And it says here, this is again offered by Nakehndan in one of his books called Zen and the Art of Saving the Planet. He writes, "Our enemy is not other people. Our enemy is hatred, violence, discrimination, and fear." End quote. And I think that's extremely powerful and something that I really hang on to when I think of transforming suffering. You know, not just my own, but when I think of being involved in community, when I think of supporting, you know, when I think of helping returning citizens, when I think of creating work, when I think of you know, supporting communities, when I think of Palestinian liberation, I think of this, that our enemies are not each other. It's discrimination, discrimination, fear, and hatred that we've been taught, right? Because like I said in the beginning, I think it's the only thing that really we can use to justify as humans to commit violence, right? Does that make sense? That it's like, again, it's so against our nature, the only way we can actually do it is by being taught hatred. And that's the only way that it can justify, because when we do that, we're hurting others, but we're also really hurting ourselves. When we engage in violence, it does a lot of harm to all of us, like to ourselves if we're the ones that are doing it as well. But I want to leave with that quote because I just think it's really, really powerful. I think it's very thought-provoking, and I think it can keep us connected when we sit here and listen to Karen Bird from Nakehndan today. She's going to share her work. And then we'll come back and we'll play a little bit of music.